It is the 12th of October, 1537. The place? Hampton Court Palace, London. After nearly 3 days of excruciating labour, the third wife of the King of England, Queen Jane Seymour, gives birth to the future King Edward VI. The king is overjoyed with his son's arrival. He orders bonfires to be lit, Te Deums to be sung in every church throughout the land, as well as a 2,000-gun salute from the Tower. Now, with the birth of a son and heir, it seems that his legacy, and that of the Tudor dynasty, is finally secure. The king's name? Henry VIII, England's most iconic king. The man known to history as King Henry VIII of England was born on the 28th of June 1491 at Greenwich Palace, just outside of London. His father was King Henry VII, the first monarch of the House of Tudor, King of England and Lord of Ireland, who reigned from 1485 when he seized the throne of England to his death in 1509, when he was succeeded by his second son and namesake Henry. He was the last King of England to secure his succession on the battlefield, which he achieved by defeating King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field, the final battle of the Wars of the Roses. Henry VIII's mother was Elizabeth of York, the daughter of King Richard III's brother, Edward IV, and as a Yorkist princess, her marriage to Henry VII allowed reconciliation and healing between the two great houses of York and Lancaster following years of civil war. She bore her husband 7 children, and their marriage was both happy and successful. Born the second son of his parents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, Henry was never expected to be king, which his upbringing and education would reflect, whereas Henry's older brother, Arthur, would be sent to Ludlow Castle in the Welsh Marches at the age of 6, where he would spend most of his time with his tutors, whose job it was to educate him to be king. This was because, as his father's heir and Prince of Wales, he was expected to rule Wales in his father's name, as well as become king himself eventually. Meanwhile, Henry, being the spare rather than the heir, received a much less rigid and rather more liberal education. Henry had several tutors who taught him grammar, rhetoric, history, philosophy, logic, arithmetic, geometry, and languages, including French, Spanish, Italian, Latin, and Greek. Henry especially enjoyed his lessons in astronomy, navigation, and cartography, interests which would fuel his later interest in naval expansion. The young prince not only excelled at his academic studies, but showed an equal facility for both athletics and music. He was even said to have composed music of his own at various times throughout his life. Henry's education also featured the markers of Catholic, Renaissance Europe, humanist principles, which dominated intellectual life at the time, with its resurrection of the Greek and Roman classics, and the application of both knowledge and reason towards progress were often part of his everyday curriculum, as was Catholic observance and theology. Brought up with his sisters, Margaret, Mary and Elizabeth, at the palace at Eltham, Henry had little contact with his brother Arthur, and it was the poet laureate John Skelton who educated Henry in moral duties, but it was his mother, Elizabeth of York, who was to teach him to write from an early age. This is evidenced by the similarities in handwriting style of mother and son, such as the written R, which they both wrote like a modern-day Z, and which differed from that of Henry's tutors. Henry was the subject of exceptional admiration as a boy, as some of the most celebrated intellectuals in Europe, including Sir Thomas More and the Dutch philosopher Erasmus, marvelled publicly at his intelligence, charm, confidence, and charisma. And Henry, as a young boy, corresponded with both of these scholars occasionally. In fact, Thomas More wrote about Henry in his poetry, calling him a saviour and a new messiah, but the compliments may have been given to gain his favour, especially in light of his great generosity. Playing on the young king's vanity, he writes that Henry has the virtue of a devoted husband, brilliant sportsman and scholar, as well as being a chivalrous prince. In 1499, Henry received Thomas More and the poet Erasmus at Eltham Palace. More presented Henry with a gift on their meeting, but Erasmus had no gift, so Henry teased him to create some poetry, which Erasmus sent to Henry with a flattering covering letter, stating that the intellect of scholars attains immortality. Henry spent a largely happy childhood surrounded by admiration, not only from his tutors and mentors, but from his mostly female family. And being the second son, Henry, unlike Arthur, was allowed to remain at home with his mother, his sisters, and his paternal grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, all of whom openly adored him. Indeed, some historians speculate that it was Henry's childhood, spent in the centre of a circle of adoring women, which made him the passionate romantic he became. But whatever the reason, Henry would marry no fewer than 6 women, in pursuit not only of a male heir, but also of love. In 1502, Henry's older brother, Arthur, died, possibly of tuberculosis or perhaps of the sweating sickness, a mysterious disease which various historians speculate might have been either anthrax, influenza, or possibly hantavirus. Also, within less than a year, Henry's beloved mother would follow her eldest son to the grave, dying of what was known as childbed fever, or puerperal fever, only a week after giving birth to her last child, a girl who would only live 8 days. Young Henry's world was now turned upside down. Henry VII took his 11-year-old son and his education firmly in hand. Now that it was clear that the boy would be king, this was the beginning of a battle between father and son. As while Arthur was still alive, Henry could be safely ignored. But now that Arthur was dead, and Henry was the Prince of Wales, the dower forbidding Henry VII became heavily involved in his son's daily life, which resulted in many a tussle of wills between the two. Chief among them concerned his father's prohibition of Henry's participation in extreme sports, the life of the Prince of Wales being too valuable to risk. Henry's desire to engage in competitive sports, particularly warriors' tournaments and jousting, was understandable for a young member of the elite raised in the age of the idealized warrior king. His hero and model of ideal kingship being his ancestor, the conqueror of France and the hero of Agincourt, Henry V. And young Henry was embarrassed at being restricted to compete in unarmed training exercises only, whilst his friends were able to both exhibit their skills and defend their manly honour in the joust. As well as this, Henry VII had taken personal charge of the disastrous state of England's finances after the ruinous Wars of the Roses. This earned him a reputation for penny pinching. Henry also shared the widespread resentment of the people towards his father, whom many considered more akin to a landlord than a great king. However, his careful, personal keeping of accounts during the last years of his reign ensured that he would leave his heir a mighty fortune. And in the coming years, Henry did not hesitate to spend it. Henry's father gave him many titles when he was still very young to keep the most lucrative and powerful appointments within the royal family. For example, in 1493 he was made Constable of Dover Castle and Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, followed by Earl Marshal of England and Lord Lieutenant of Ireland at the age of just 3. He was then appointed a Knight of the Bath, and shortly after, his father made him Duke of York and Warden of the Scottish Marches. And then, in May 1495, he was appointed to the Order of the Garter. When Henry VII died on the 21st of April 1509, his son was immediately proclaimed King Henry VIII to an atmosphere of hope and joy among nobles, courtiers, and the English people alike, and many predicted the beginning of a golden age for England, as the tall, athletic, handsome, red-haired Henry was already widely popular for his sunny personality, his humour, his intelligence, and his confidence. His father's reign had been continually unstable, and he had never quite been able to banish the label of usurper, which continued to be whispered among disaffected sections of the nobility. These elites hated not only the manner in which Henry VII ruled, but how he had become king, killing the Yorkist king, Richard III, at the Battle of Bosworth Field, and so ending the Wars of the Roses. Victory by feat of arms was one of the recognised methods of gaining the throne in the medieval world, but the Tudors' claim to rule England, due to their lineage, was never as strong as either the previous Lancastrian King Henry VI or their rivals, the House of York, as although Henry's mother, Margaret Beaufort, was a direct descendant of John of Gaunt, as were the Yorks, the Tudor branch was descended from John's third marriage to the widow Catherine Swynford, the children of which had been conceived on the wrong side of the blanket, or out of wedlock. Henry VII would never feel fully secure in his right to the crown, as although the children were legitimised in 1397, they were barred from inheriting the throne. However, Henry VIII, unlike his father, never had any personal doubts about his right to accede to the throne, and thanks to his popularity, nor did anyone else. For example, in his coronation ode for King Henry and his new wife, Queen Catherine, Henry's old mentor and friend, Thomas More, wrote, quote, "This day is the beginning of our freedom, the end of sadness, the source of joy. This day consecrates a young man who is worthy, not merely to govern a single people, but singly to rule the whole world." But in the fullness of time, Thomas More would likely come to regret ever putting the notion of absolute power into the young king's head. Only 3 weeks after his father's death, on the 11th of June, 1509, the 17-year-old King Henry married the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon, his brother Arthur's widow, and 6 years his senior, in a brief, private ceremony at the Church of the Observant Friars, just outside of Greenwich Palace. At this time, next to France, Spain was the most powerful country in Europe, and a Spanish marriage brought significant financial, political, and military advantages to Henry's reign. However, many historians agree, and Henry's surviving letters testify, that the appeal of the marriage went beyond political advantage, and that Henry and Catherine truly loved and admired one another. 2 weeks after their wedding, on the 24th of June 1509, Henry and Catherine were crowned King and Queen of England in Westminster Abbey. The procession route from the Palace of Westminster to the Abbey was decorated with cloth of gold and exquisite tapestries, and both Henry and Catherine were resplendent in their rich costumes. Henry in a jewel-decorated cloth of gold coat with a red velvet, ermine-trimmed robe, and Catherine dressed in a rich mantle of cloth of tissue, with a silk circlet of gold and pearl on her head, and her long auburn hair unbound. The Archbishop of Canterbury, William Warham, anointed the royal couple with holy oil and crowned them both, to cries of "Vivat, Vivat Rex," or "Long live the King." And after the wedding, 2 days of feasting and armed tournaments followed. The first years of Henry's reign and marriage appear to have been happy, active, and ambitious ones for both King Henry and Catherine. Their court was purposefully modelled after those of the warrior kings of the medieval period, and Henry and his courtiers enjoyed both watching and participating in the frequent rounds of jousts and tournaments. And in true chivalric fashion, Henry publicly lavished attention on his queen, wearing her favours prominently over his armour during the joust, and declaring himself her loyal heart. The English court under Henry VIII was exceptionally decadent. Henry himself spent extravagantly on clothing, jewels, and fine furnishings. The richest foods were served daily at the royal court, often with as many as 7 courses served at mealtimes, and even more amazing, each so-called course might consist of as many as 20 different dishes. In January of 1510, a mere 7 months after her wedding, the Queen was delivered of her first child, sadly a stillborn daughter, and 1 year later, in January of 1511, Catherine gave birth to a son, Prince Henry, who, tragically, survived for less than 2 months. This tragedy for the royal couple was followed by another stillbirth in 1513, and yet another short-lived son in 1515. Henry's famous reputation as a tyrant might lead some to believe that Catherine's initial failure to produce an heir for England may have been a point of contention between the Queen and her husband. In fact, Henry and Catherine's marriage continued in a seemingly warm and supportive state for several years. Henry appears to have been both patient and understanding with Catherine's struggle to give him an heir. Indeed, it is important to note that in 16th century England, a high rate of child mortality was much more common than it is today, and a wife, especially a noble or royal wife, might have up to 14 children to compensate for this sad fact, and depending on circumstances, between 1/3 and 1/2 of pregnancies would result in miscarriages, stillbirths, or infant mortality. And whilst these occurrences were considered tragic, Catherine's demonstrated ability to conceive easily was actually an encouraging sign that she would eventually give birth to a son and heir. In the meantime, the young royal couple demonstrated impressive collaboration in the governance and management of England's affairs. Henry forgave many of his father's debtors and made efforts to bury the enmity with those who had clashed with his father. His charm and magnanimity won him the support of both the nobility and the people. As well as this, Catherine was also beloved for her intelligence, strength, piety, and devotion to the English people. And when Henry launched a joint invasion of France with the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I in the summer of 1513, he left Catherine to serve as regent in his absence, a clear sign of the love, trust, and faith he placed in her. Pope Julius II and King Louis XII of France were at war over the Italian states ruled by the papacy. Pope Julius excommunicated Louis, forming a coalition of nations, and to sway the young Henry to join them in the league, he sent him barrels of Italian wine, a gold-covered rose, and a shipment of Parmesan cheeses. And in 1513, the Venetian ambassador also appealed to King Henry to aid them in the threat of war against France. However, Archbishop Warham preached for peace and against the evils of war. As well as this, Thomas Wolsey, Henry's Lord Chancellor, who was low-born but hugely intelligent, educated at Magdalen College, Oxford, also advised against war with Scotland. That was until he came to realise that his future lay in liberating Henry from the influence of his advisors, those who countersigned with seals any royal grant or law, and with the support of Wolsey, Henry could free himself from the control of his councillors. And so, on the 28th of June 1513, the decision for war taken, the King and Queen arrived at Dover Castle before Henry crossed the Channel the following day to join the fight against King Louis of France. And for the first time in 100 years, an English king sought to extend his dominion on the continent, which after the losses in the 100 Years' War had been reduced to a small enclave around Calais. Henry's first victory was at Terouanne, followed by a triumph at the Battle of the Spurs, so named because the mounted French knights fled the field so quickly. And whilst Henry pursued his dreams of English martial glory in France, Catherine was busy confronting an invasion of England by the Scots under King James IV, and within 2 months of Henry's invasion of France, King James invaded England in support of his French allies. Catherine, however, proved equal to the challenge in Henry's absence. As the daughter of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, not only had she been exposed to court politics and intrigues since childhood, but she had also spent a good portion of that childhood exposed to the strategies of warfare. And in a letter written on the 13th of August 1513 to Margaret of Savoy, daughter of the Emperor Maximilian, Catherine humbly joked that she was busily involved in the virtuous woman's work of sewing banners for the campaign against the Scots. In fact, Catherine was personally involved in the military mobilization and strategy for England's defence when the English, heavily represented by longbowmen and led by Thomas Howard, the Earl of Surrey, defeated the Scots at the Battle of Flodden, when they invaded in accordance with their alliance with France, which had first come into being in the reign of Edward I 200 years earlier. At the battle, the English forces were victorious over a greater Scottish force, and the Scottish king, James IV, perished on the battlefield, along with as many as 17,000 of his 40,000-strong army, whilst the English, in contrast, lost only 1,500 of their 26,000-strong host. The Queen, in writing to Henry after the victory, praised him for his successes abroad, and sent as a token of her own triumph a shred of the Scottish king's coat to add to the king's banners, as his army carried on to take parts of Flanders, as well as Tournai, where he built a great castle, a symbol of his burgeoning empire. 3 years later, and 7 years into their marriage, Henry and Catherine's patience was rewarded when on the 18th of February 1516, Catherine gave birth to a daughter, Princess Mary, the future Mary I, who would be the only child of the king and queen to survive into adulthood. England rejoiced. Mary's birth and survival contained the promise, eventually, of a male heir. At the time, no woman had ever been Queen of England in her own right, but regardless, in the absence of a son, Henry appeared to treat his daughter as a true Princess of Wales. He even sent her to live at Ludlow Castle, as was the tradition for the English king-in-waiting, and he also ensured that she was educated as carefully as any prince. Mary was loved and doted on by both of her parents. Catherine took her early education in hand personally, and Henry was openly affectionate and indulgent with his daughter, whom he called "my pearl in the world." However, by the 1520s, it would become apparent that Catherine's failure to produce a son and heir would make the ground she stood upon shakier every year. As because Catherine was, more or less, constantly pregnant for the first decade of her marriage, Henry began to take mistresses with more regularity. Such behaviour was not necessarily an indication of his waning interest in his wife, however, as it was commonly believed in the medieval world that sex during pregnancy was potentially dangerous to the health of the baby, and it was also commonly believed that regular sex was essential to a man's overall health, as according to the prevailing humoral theory of health and disease, any build-up or imbalance of any kind in the body's fluids or humours could cause illness. Indeed, with Catherine so frequently pregnant, it might have been strange had Henry not taken a mistress, yet it could not have failed to pain Catherine when in June of 1519, Elizabeth Blount, one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, gave birth to Henry's son, whom Henry even acknowledged as his own child. The boy was named Henry FitzRoy, literally meaning son of the king, and Henry lavished attention and wealth on his son, intending him to have a life of privilege, if not legitimization. In dignified fashion, Catherine honourably retired Bessie Blount from her service, but continued to respectfully receive her. Still, it must have saddened her to have Henry's mistress and illegitimate son celebrated so publicly at court, especially as, in medieval Europe, women were frequently blamed for their inability to have children, and it was generally believed that miscarriages and stillbirths were largely caused by the actions of the mother, perhaps through careless behaviour or eating habits. And with the birth of Henry FitzRoy, Henry had proven that he could father a son. And while Henry never openly blamed Catherine for her failure to produce a boy, it is likely that the continued absence of a legitimate heir, some 10 years into his marriage, stoked resentment as well as anxiety in him. Henry was now 27 years old, and Catherine was 33. The time left for her to conceive was growing short. Indeed, following the birth of Princess Mary, Catherine would become pregnant and give birth only once more to a stillborn daughter in 1518, and within a decade, Henry's attempts to address this shortcoming would change the face of England forever. His dynastic troubles aside, the first 10 years of Henry's reign clearly reflected his ambitious pursuit of glory, fame, and virtue. Henry set out to make England the equal of both France and Spain in wealth, power, and prestige. And early on in his reign, he sponsored the construction of dockyards, warehouses, and shipyards in coastal ports, and sourced huge amounts of timber from the forests of Sussex and Kent for the construction of ships. Henry's father had become king in the very infancy of Europe's age of exploration, and not to be outdone by the Spanish, he had begun a process of naval expansion. However, upon the death of Henry VII, England could boast a navy of only 5 ships, but by the time of Henry VIII's death, England's navy would comprise 50 ships. In 1518, with the threat of a Turkish invasion of southeastern Europe looming, a prospect which alarmed all Christendom, Henry signed a non-aggression pact with Charles V, the new Holy Roman Emperor, and Francis I, King of France. The agreement was the beginning of several such summit talks, which took place over the next 2 years between the three European powers, largely planned and orchestrated by Henry's Lord Chancellor and papal legate in England, Cardinal Wolsey. The most impressive of these diplomatic meetings would be the Field of Cloth of Gold, which took place in France near Calais from the 7th to the 24th of June 1520. At the summit, Henry and Francis signed a pledge of perpetual friendship and peace. Princess Mary was betrothed to the Dauphin of France, and all in attendance enjoyed a week of feasting, drinking, entertainment, international tournaments, and jousting contests amid the exquisite cloth of gold tents and cleverly constructed canvas pavilions, painted to look as if they were built of stone. However, despite the pomp, ceremony, and elaborate rituals of the Field of Cloth of Gold, the alliance between Henry and Francis would be a fair-weather one over the next few decades, as shortly afterwards, Cardinal Wolsey would sign an alliance with Charles V of Spain, who declared war on France later in 1521, starting the Italian War of 1521 to 1526. Henry was determined to be remembered as a prince of intellect and virtue, as well as one skilled at statesmanship. Indeed, when the publications of Martin Luther, beginning in 1517, had scandalized Catholic Europe and outraged Henry himself, he personally wrote and published, in 1521, a response to Luther's attack on the Church, called the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, or Defense of the Seven Sacraments. In this document, Henry attacked Luther's ideas, defended sacred Catholic practices, and affirmed, in all religious matters, the supremacy of the Pope, to whom Henry dedicated his book, and in recognition of his service to the Church, Pope Leo X gave Henry the title Fide Defensor, or Defender of the Faith. Some historians suggest that Henry's mentor and friend, Sir Thomas More, may have assisted in the writing of the historic document, which was only the second book to be written by an English king, and reportedly, during the editing process, More suggested that Henry might want to state the broad scope of the Pope's power more lightly. But Henry was adamantly against softening either his condemnation of Luther or his defense of the Pope's right to rule God's Church on earth. Ironically, it would be this very issue that would undermine Henry's bond of friendship with More, and for which More would eventually lose his life. Culturally, Henry was a devout Catholic, and evidence suggests that he essentially remained so throughout his life. However, his commitment to the Pope's right to govern the Church would present him with perhaps his greatest dilemma, when his views conflicted with both his desire to remarry and his increasingly desperate need for a son and heir, the one thing that seemed to be out of his reach. By the mid-1520s, the situation became more strained. Henry was no longer the popular teenage king, but was still a fairly young man in his early 30s, and never having abandoned his athletic lifestyle and pursuits, he had kept his trim handsomeness and vigour. Catherine, however, was nearing 40, and had gained a great deal of weight in the years since her marriage. As well as this, 6 pregnancies in 9 years had wreaked havoc on her body, and Catherine, now past childbearing age, was losing both the love and interest of her husband. In 1526, Anne Boleyn came to the Tudor court as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine, the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, Henry's ambassador to France. Anne had recently returned from the French court with her father, and was much admired for her cosmopolitan air, her style, wit, and charm. And still in her mid-20s, she was fashionable and attractive, with dark hair and eyes, and commanded attention at court, and Henry, longing for a younger, more vivacious wife who might give him a son, fell deeply in love with her. Initially, for the first few months of their courtship, there seemed to be no question of Henry casting off his wife. He frequently begged Anne to become his mistress, which she refused to do, insisting that she would give her virginity only to her husband. Henry's letters to Anne, some of which survive, are full of passionate declarations of his love and desire for her. Henry continually commissioned new jewels and trinkets for her, and publicly showed her favour and affection. In historical terms, Anne Boleyn has been given the reputation of the other woman, at worst, a grasping political climber and conspirator who usurped the place of a legitimate wife and queen, much loved by the English people. However, there is no evidence that she encouraged Henry's interest in her initially. Indeed, she reportedly made an abrupt departure from court in the spring of 1527, returning to her family's home at Hever Castle, and the letter that Henry wrote to Anne soon after her departure conveys the impression that she might have left simply to avoid Henry's ardour and avoid turning down a king who held power over the livelihood and lives of the entire court. The letter from Henry reads, quote, "In turning over in my mind the contents of your last letters, I have put myself into great agony, not knowing how to interpret them, whether to my disadvantage, as you show in some places, or to my advantage, as I understand them in some others, beseeching you earnestly to let me know expressly your whole mind as to the love between us two. It is absolutely necessary for me to obtain this answer, having been for above a whole year stricken with the dart of love, and not yet sure whether I shall fail of finding a place in your heart and affection." While some might accuse her of playing a skillful game of manipulation, it seems unlikely that a young woman like Anne, from a respectable but not a powerful family, would imagine that she could be anything more than Henry's temporary mistress. It is difficult to believe that Anne might be presumptuous enough to think that she could take Henry from his legitimate wife, or that she might emerge victorious from a battle with the Queen of England. Moreover, a liaison with the king would no doubt place her marriage prospects and future prosperity at great risk, and it is far more likely that she came to love Henry as he loved her. But after her abrupt departure from court, Henry continued writing to Anne and sending her gifts, and in time, Anne began to respond to Henry with feelings and gifts of her own, and the two carried on their relationship quite publicly at court. There is, of course, no way to know whether Anne and Henry maintained their abstinence, as Anne had insisted she must. However, the fact that Anne did not become pregnant throughout the nearly 7 years of their courtship suggests she stayed chaste. Methods of contraception were available at the time, but were extremely unreliable. So while Henry and Anne were likely intimate with one another, there is no evidence which suggests that they slept together prior to late 1532 at the earliest. By 1527, a year after Anne's arrival at court, Henry determined to seek a divorce from Catherine so he could marry Anne. Henry's rationale for the divorce has been argued by some to illustrate the fundamental flaws in his personality, a tendency towards cold abandonment and indifference towards those he had no more use for, as well as a willingness to interpret facts to suit himself. When Henry had first married Catherine, he had done so against objections from all sides because he loved her. The Pope issued a special dispensation to allow Henry to marry Catherine, since she had been wed first to Henry's brother, Arthur, and Henry and Catherine's marriage, according to Catholic doctrine, could otherwise have been considered incest, based on a provision in Leviticus 20:21, quote, "If any man should take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing, they will be childless." And so, when teenage Henry had wanted to marry Catherine, he readily accepted both the Pope's dispensation and Catherine's claim that her 6-month marriage to Arthur had never actually been consummated due to Arthur's continual ill health, and it was not until years later, when Henry had fallen in love with Anne and the possibility of having a son had become realistic again, that Henry decided that Catherine and Arthur's marriage may actually have been consummated. He reasoned that the Pope had overreached his own authority, and that the very reason he had no son was because his current marriage was a sin against God, for which divorce was the only remedy. Henry's ambition for love and an heir changed everything. The king would spend the next few years pursuing the great matter of his divorce. He began with a direct appeal to Pope Clement VII, hoping that his noted devotion to the Catholic Church would secure him an annulment, a prospect which, at the time, was not as outrageous a request as it seems today, as for literally centuries, various successive popes had dissolved literally dozens of royal marriages, even marriages of relatively long duration, which had already produced children, most of which were annulled for political reasons, although official annulments always cited some biblical or doctrinal explanation for the dissolution of these marriages. However, Henry was about to find his dreams of a quick and easy divorce dashed, when in 1527, Emperor Charles V sacked Rome and took the Pope as his prisoner. In addition to being arguably the most powerful man in Europe, Charles was also Queen Catherine's nephew. And by this point, even if the Pope had wished to grant Henry his divorce, he would have been unable to. Henry then turned to Cardinal Wolsey, who had never failed him, and who owed literally all he had to the king. Thomas Wolsey was not born to the nobility, like most clergymen of the day who became archbishops, cardinals, and papal legates. Instead, Wolsey was the son of a butcher from Ipswich, originally an obscure chaplain, until, under Henry's patronage, he was made bishop, archbishop, and cardinal in fairly quick succession. Wolsey had not only been Henry's Lord Chancellor, he had also been his mentor, as a young king still finding his way. But whatever the reason for Wolsey's failure to procure the divorce, whether inability or reluctance, it would lead to his ruin. The Cardinal, working with Cardinal Campeggio, a special legate appointed by the Pope, set up a legatine court to determine Henry's great matter. But the court was unable to reach a decision with regard to the merit of Henry's claims for an annulment, and ruled that the matter should be decided by the College of Cardinals in Rome. It is unclear whether Wolsey truly wanted to give Henry his desire, or if, like his ecclesiastical counterparts, he saw the danger of allowing the king to divorce his famously pious Catholic wife and marry Anne, who was reliably rumoured to be a Lutheran reformer. But whatever his intentions, the failure of the legatine court led to Wolsey's downfall, as Henry commanded his arrest and imprisonment, citing the treasonous tone of letters Wolsey had written to Vatican officials. However, the cardinal in fact died of natural causes on his way to London before Henry could behead him. Adding insult to injury, Henry took possession of Hampton Court, the fabulous palace which Wolsey had personally transformed from a more modest country house. He had intended it as a venue from which to entertain the king, the nobles, and prominent foreign visitors, but Henry and his court took residence there, only months after the cardinal's death in 1530. The king continued to improve upon it over the years, and whilst Henry maintained more than 60 residences, Hampton Court Palace remained his favourite, and he would spend a great deal of time there throughout the remainder of his reign. Henry did not sit idly by, waiting for the College of Cardinals or the Pope to decide the fate of his marriage. Instead, he began to canvass the opinions of theologians at Europe's universities, asking them to study, deliberate, and pronounce a verdict on the merits of his case for divorce. However, Henry would be disappointed twice more, as the majority of university theologians, and later the College of Cardinals, would decide in favour of Queen Catherine, declaring the king's first marriage valid after all. It is unclear when Henry first began to consider repudiating the Pope's authority in England, thus removing the obstacle to his divorce. Anne Boleyn's influence as a Lutheran sympathiser and reformer is entirely plausible, as is the influence of Thomas Cromwell, another reformer, who was first Henry's private secretary and later rose to become Lord Privy Seal. In fact, there were quite a few reformers in the English Parliament and at court at the time, and anti-clericalism was rife among them. But perhaps it was his introduction to the little-known clergyman and theology professor from Cambridge, Thomas Cranmer, which truly planted the seed in his mind. According to Cranmer, who was a passionate reformer, kings, anointed by God, answered only to God, and therefore Henry should not have to pursue his divorce through legal means. This atmosphere and these ideas may have emboldened Henry to formally break with the Catholic Church and pursue one of the most radical bids for power ever made by a European monarch, the claim to the absolute powers of both king and pope. It would take nearly 2 years for Henry to establish the fulfilment of his will over both Parliament and the English clergy, but by 1532, Henry had what he wanted. He was the supreme head of the Church in England, and Parliament had legislated a full break with the Pope, stopping virtually all payments to Rome, and because he wanted his great matter decided by the English Church, which was much better from a public relations standpoint than declaring it himself, he made Thomas Cranmer Archbishop of Canterbury, empowering him to lead the clergy to the right decision. In other words, to vote in Henry's favour with regard to his divorce. In April of 1533, Archbishop Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid, but by that time, Henry had already been remarried for 4 months, having wed Anne Boleyn in a secret ceremony on the 25th of January 1533, and some historians suggest that when she came to the altar, Anne was already pregnant. As on September 7th, 1533, just over 7 months after their marriage, Anne gave birth to Princess Elizabeth, the future Elizabeth I of England. Henry well understood the enormity of what he had done, and he moved swiftly to consolidate his new powers and impose his will implacably upon the English people. Catherine of Aragon was still widely popular, and the new Queen Anne was widely resented. But more importantly, the majority of the English people still identified closely with Roman Catholicism. Henry knew he would have to establish control quickly, before the foreign influence and support of Catholic Europe emboldened uneasy Catholic Englishmen to act, and his answer was the Act of Supremacy, which he proposed following his marriage to Anne, and which Parliament passed in 1534. The Act required all the king's subjects to swear an oath, recognising Henry as supreme head of the Church, and affirming the legality of the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn. Refusal to swear the oath was considered treason, the punishment for which was death. For devoted Catholics, the oath of supremacy was seen as a referendum on morality. Most chose to swear the oath and escape with their lives, no matter how painful the cost to their beliefs. Others, like Henry's old friend and mentor, Sir Thomas More, would not. More had largely retired from court and public life in general. Following the death of Thomas Wolsey, Henry had named More Lord Chancellor, a post which he resigned from only 2 years later in 1532, alienated and demoralised by the erosion of papal authority he had witnessed at court. He had never spoken publicly against the king or against his marriage to Anne, but as of 1535, he remained one of only a few of Henry's subjects who still had not taken the oath. More's refusal to do so resulted in him being imprisoned in the Tower, and at his trial, when it was clear that he would be found guilty, he loudly affirmed the authority of the Pope over all matters religious, and denied the ability of Parliament to declare the king head of the Church. More was immediately sentenced to death for treason, a crime which carried the penalty of hanging, drawing and quartering. Henry had already demonstrated that he was not averse to removing his subjects when they failed to deliver, challenged his power, or acted contrary to his will. But perhaps it is a small testament to his remembrance of More's friendship and service to him that Henry commuted his sentence to beheading. On the 6th of July, 1535, Thomas More went bravely to the scaffold. He jokingly asked the executioner to hold on a moment while he shifted his beard from the edge of the block, saying that, after all, he, not it, had committed treason, and in a loud, clear voice, he declared that he died the king's good servant and God's first. Henry and Anne had finally removed all who seemed openly opposed to the new order. The death of Catherine of Aragon from natural causes on the 7th of January 1536 appeared to remove the last barrier to the legitimacy of their marriage. But a dark cloud still hovered. Anne had become pregnant twice following the birth of Elizabeth, but both pregnancies had resulted in miscarriages. Additionally, some historians have speculated that Henry and Anne's relationship was growing increasingly strained due to Anne's failure to adjust to a new role of wife. As Henry's mistress, she might have been allowed a certain amount of license to speak and act as she pleased. Her prolonged refusal to sleep with Henry likely put her in a rather dominant position. However, as Henry's wife, she would be expected to be far more submissive. But of course, her lack of submissiveness would likely have been overlooked had she not committed the unpardonable sin of failing to produce a son. In the spring of 1536, after her final miscarriage, accusations of adultery were levelled at Anne, and Henry chose to believe them. Private interrogations of the Queen's household elicited far more fantastic claims of her degeneracy, accusing her of incest and witchcraft, in addition to adultery. At her speedy trial, for which she was not permitted to be present, she was found guilty, and on the 31st of May 1536, Anne Boleyn was taken to the scaffold. With dignity, she spoke briefly and movingly of her love for the king, her sins of pride, and her desire that the people pray for her. But within 24 hours of his second wife's execution, Henry was already betrothed to Anne's lady-in-waiting, and the woman who had become his third wife, Lady Jane Seymour. While Lady Jane, like her family, had sworn the oath of supremacy, she was rumoured to be sympathetic to the old religion of Catholicism. Some expected that perhaps now, with Anne Boleyn gone, Henry would backtrack on some of his radical religious policies. However, the reforms, if anything, accelerated, and Henry ordered Thomas Cromwell to begin the dissolution of England's monasteries. After Anne's death in 1536, abbeys, shrines and monasteries throughout England were purged of religious relics such as fragments of the True Cross and vials supposedly containing the blood of Christ, which on one occasion proved to be the blood of ducks. This statewide, systematic clampdown was not only undertaken for theological reasons, but also largely because the seizure of church property brought in a colossal amount of revenue to the royal coffers. And so, throughout the realm, abbeys were reduced to ruins and their contents plundered, whilst anyone who resisted Henry's will was put to an agonizing death, be they familiar to the king or be they humble peasant. In short, Henry now demanded nothing less than total, unquestioning submission from every man, woman and child, whose bodies and souls he now held in the palm of his hand. However, Henry's new order was not implemented without resistance, as in the autumn of 1536, a massive uprising broke out in the north of England, known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, which Henry only quelled through attempts at appeasement, followed by brutal reprisals. Marching in the name of the king, carrying banners depicting the 5 wounds of Christ, the rebels demanded the return of the abbeys, the revival of sacred Catholic ceremonies and holidays, and the dismissal of the king's devious ministers, especially Cromwell, whom they blamed for the new religious policies. The rebels numbered an incredible 40,000 strong, the largest army on English soil since before the reign of Henry VII. To appease the mob, Henry VIII promised them a pardon and to negotiate a fair settlement with them if they dispersed and put a stop to any further rebellion. However, when further disturbances broke out in the north, Henry unleashed a brutal repression, and hundreds of rebel leaders were arrested and executed, after which Henry proclaimed that, quote, "Our pleasure is that dreadful execution be done on a good number of the inhabitants of every town, village and hamlet that have offended in this rebellion." Indeed, even his own family were not spared Henry's wrath, as when the wife who replaced Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, begged him on her knees to restore the abbeys, he exploded with, quote, "Get up. Do not presume to meddle in my affairs. Remember Anne." The desecration of the monasteries continued apace for 4 more years. The confiscated wealth made Henry one of the richest monarchs in Europe, and in disgust, the Pope excommunicated Henry in 1538, which meant that England was now surrounded by hostile powers. The king resolved to use his newly appropriated fortune to build up the country's defences, with the construction of hundreds of forts and gun emplacements along the English coast, the materials for which often came from the monasteries and abbeys themselves, making England a veritable island fortress, which combined with the growing English navy, formed the blueprint for English defensive and offensive strategies over the next 300 years. Between 1536 and 1539, Henry also pursued other avenues to reinforce the new religious life of England. The 10 Articles of Faith were published in 1536, an English translation of the Bible appeared in 1537, as well as the Institution of the Christian Man, or the Bishop's Book, as it was more commonly known, and by 1539 it was clear to Henry that the theological and doctrinal differences between Catholics and Protestants had hardened, and the situation had grown even murkier. Which religion demonstrated the correct Christian observance and perspective? Henry realized that preserving his supremacy and securing peace in religious life was going to require uniformity. If he could not simply proclaim it, he would have to impose it by law. Henry first established a special committee of clergymen to deliberate on 6 doctrinal questions, the answers to which would form the basic articles of faith for the Church of England. Naturally, the committee knew what was expected of them, and they produced 6 articles of faith, which essentially preserved the Catholic doctrines and observance with which Henry and many other conservatives in England were comfortably familiar. English Protestants were crushed, and it seemed that the only aspect of Catholic doctrine which the 6 articles had left out was allegiance to the Pope. Henry was never a Protestant, but he was unwilling to have anyone reign supreme above him. But worst of all, the Act of 6 Articles, passed in 1539, required a public endorsement by everyone, and to deny any one of the 6 articles was to be labelled a heretic, and to face trial and execution by burning at the stake. Henry's actions could be considered incredibly merciless, but this callous reputation deserves some special attention and explanation. As a young man, Henry was widely known as generous, kind, and good-humoured, but later in life, he was often regarded as an irascible personality with a hideous temper, who delighted in terrorising anyone who displeased him. This dramatic shift in personality is plain to see, and there is a fairly concrete explanation for it, which is that Henry was in almost constant pain with an ongoing disability. On the 24th of January 1536, 2 days before Anne Boleyn miscarried her last child, and 5 months before her execution, the still vigorous 45-year-old Henry suffered a terrible accident in the jousting lists when he fell from his horse. The heavily armoured horse then fell on Henry, nearly crushing his leg, and he was unconscious for several hours. When he awoke, he would find that his life had changed forever. His accident had opened an older wound on his leg, which, over time, became ever more ulcerated and severe. Part of the problem was the 16th century physicians, who believed that wounds should be left open to allow pus to continue draining, the build-up of which, according to the humoral theory, could cause illness, and many of the treatments Henry was subjected to over the remaining 10 years of his life probably did more harm than good, causing increasing infections and inflammation, which could not have failed to be excruciatingly painful. From 1536 onward, a vastly different Henry emerged, one racked by constant pain, given to furious rage, and increasingly feared for his unpredictable moods and behaviour. His marriage to Jane Seymour later that same year, and her pregnancy 7 months later, likely brightened Henry's hopes for the future. But the new restrictions on his life and activities took their toll on him. No longer could he engage in his usual vigorous athletic pursuits, and he was forced to confront physical decline, loss of independence, and depression. As always, Henry remained fond of wine and food, and continued to eat the extravagant multi-course meals served twice daily at the Tudor court. Henry would steadily gain more and more weight over the next decade, and by the last year of his life, Henry was close to 400 pounds, with a waistline of 54 inches, and, unable to walk, he had to be carried about the Tudor court in a reinforced litter. His injuries from the jousting accident in 1536 did not discourage his pursuit of a male heir, of love, glory, and fame, but it did completely change his daily life, and undeniably, his personality also. Henry and Jane had only been married about 15 months when she gave birth to Prince Edward, which seemingly set the seal on all of Henry's ambitions. But tragically, Jane would only live for another 2 weeks, dying of puerperal fever, just as Henry's mother had, as childbirth in Renaissance Europe was a dangerous business, killing approximately 1 in 3 women in 16th century Europe. It was beset by emergencies, which midwives and physicians often handled improperly or did not know how to handle, with numerous opportunities for life-threatening infections to set in. While overjoyed at the birth of a son, Henry was crushed by Jane's death. Whether it was because she had given him the male heir that he had so long desired, or because they had not been married long enough for Henry's love to fade, the king went into deepest mourning and seclusion. He would not marry again for more than 2 years. However, both Henry and his courtiers understood that just one son was not enough to guarantee the security of the throne, and they began urging him to remarry and produce another heir soon after Jane's death. Henry's 4th wife was Anne of Cleves, a German princess and sister to the Duke of Cleves. Henry had commissioned the great Tudor court painter, Hans Holbein, to paint her portrait, and had admired Anne's beauty and poise, as depicted in Holbein's painting. He expressed intense disappointment upon meeting her, however, screaming abuse at Thomas Cromwell, who had been so eager for the marriage alliance with the Protestant Cleves. Henry was bitterly disappointed, exclaiming, "I like her not." But because he had already alienated predominantly Catholic Europe, Henry did not wish to offend his new German allies, and so he duly married Anne of Cleves on the 6th of January 1540, but immediately began to seek avenues to have the marriage annulled. "She has evil smells about her," Henry insisted, after the wedding night, seemingly ignoring his own hideous stench from his constantly ulcerated leg. He also claimed that the looseness of her breasts and other tokens indicated that she was not a virgin. Within 6 months, Henry had his marriage to Anne annulled on the grounds of her supposedly binding pre-contract to marry the son of the Duke of Lorraine. Anne fared better than most of Henry's wives, as because she accepted the annulment with grace, Henry gifted her with an estate and an annual income, inviting her to think of herself as His Majesty's sister. Henry then imprisoned his Lord Privy Seal, Thomas Cromwell, in the Tower for his mishandling of the king's marriage and for his radical reformist sympathies. Cromwell was beheaded on the 28th of July, 1540. And on the same day, Henry married one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, the great-niece of the Duke of Norfolk, 17-year-old Catherine Howard. Like Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard receives a somewhat tarnished reputation in history for her flightiness and her adultery with the king's groom, Thomas Culpeper. Her behaviour does, however, tell us much about the marriage to the king. Henry was 51 years old when he married Catherine, and growing older, sicker, and heavier all the time. There were rumours also of his impotence, which, considering his health and the constant pain he endured, would have been understandable. And some historians have speculated that such sexual problems might have formed the basis of Henry's failure to consummate his marriage to Anne of Cleves as well. The years of 1540 and 1541 were also busy ones for Henry. He was consumed with the reconquest of Ireland, and under these circumstances, it is hardly surprising that the teenaged Catherine might have found her new role as queen tedious, unrewarding, even lonely. She began her affair with Thomas Culpeper, arranging clandestine meetings, writing him love letters, and sending him gifts. The rumours of her behaviour soon began to circulate, and it eventually came to light that she had also engaged in a sexual relationship with her private secretary, Francis Derham, before marrying the king. Catherine would pay the ultimate price for the mistakes of her tragically short life, as she was beheaded on the 13th of February 1542 at the age of 19, the day after the executions of both Culpeper and Derham. The following year, on the 12th of July 1543, Henry married his 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr. She was attractive, wealthy, twice widowed, educated, and highly intelligent. The 31-year-old Catherine seemed a good match for Henry, despite her tendency to be exceptionally outspoken. She made a marked effort to be a mother to Henry's 3 children, and encouraged a much closer family environment. It was at this time that Henry decided to reinstate his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, whom he had previously declared to be bastards, to the line of succession, after his son Edward. Many historians attribute this decision to Catherine Parr's influence. Henry and Catherine seemed to enjoy both a cooperative and companionable marriage, and when Henry launched yet another invasion of France in 1544, attempting to stem French support for the Scots, with whom England was also at war, Henry made Catherine regent in his absence, a clear endorsement of her intelligence, competence, and his trust in her. While they were a seemingly good match, they did clash largely over religious matters. Catherine Parr was a committed Protestant reformer. She published no less than 3 books, all of which testified to her religious convictions. Her second book, Prayers and Meditations, published in 1545, was the first book published by an English queen in her own name. Her writings would not endear her to the more conservative religious elements at court, many of whose prejudices Henry himself shared, and Henry even went as far as to issue a warrant for Catherine's arrest for her heretical opinions. But the warrant was never carried out, and the couple eventually reconciled their differences. Catherine did not publish her third book, The Lamentation of a Sinner, until after Henry's death. By late 1546, Henry had become increasingly ill, and after making a few final adjustments to his will, he withdrew from his family into seclusion at Whitehall Palace. His condition deteriorated steadily over the month of January, yet Henry's physicians feared to inform him of their strong suspicion that he was dying, since imagining or discussing the death of the king was considered treason. And so Henry's doctors summoned one of his courtiers instead to give him the news. And on the evening of the 27th of January 1547, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was summoned to hear Henry's last confession. By the time Cranmer arrived, he found the king's condition was such that he was unable to speak. Cranmer comforted the king by asking if he trusted in God. In reply, the king squeezed Cranmer's hand. Henry died in the early hours of the morning of the 28th of January 1547. Henry's life and reign was a fascinating mixture of both the best and the worst of kingly behaviour, seen by some as an elaborate pageant featuring high hopes, hideous crimes, and a fevered search for love, glory and fame by an increasingly tyrannical king. Many of his decisions could be seen as impulsive, short-sighted or selfish, although whether intentional or not, the medium to long-term effects of Henry's decisions were to make him arguably the most powerful monarch in English and British history, as he was both head of state and church. Next to his daughter Elizabeth, Henry VIII remains England's most iconic monarch, one who permanently changed the religious life and culture of England. His assumption of the role of supreme head of the church caused a veritable earthquake, whose aftershocks would continue to be felt for nearly 2 centuries after his death, causing 200 years of religious turmoil in England. The resulting break with the Roman Catholic Church paved the way for England, and later Britain, to forge their own destinies in centuries to come, like the other Protestant nations of Europe, and to embrace new scientific methods and forms of government which would enable them to eclipse the Catholic powers and make England and the Royal Navy, which Henry is credited in part with founding, dominant on the global stage, expanding the powers of the monarchy to a peak never surpassed by any other English king or queen. What do you think of King Henry VIII? Was he merely a tyrant, whose cruelty was unremarkable for a European king during the Renaissance, or was he a strong, iconic monarch, determined to rule over the entirety of his own country on his own terms? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. We would like to draw your attention to our revamped Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee membership pages, which contain rewards and perks such as early access to our content, merchandise discounts, and audio versions of our videos, along with much more that we give to our valued supporters. If you have not yet signed up to help our cause, we'd like to ask you to please consider doing so, as we need to secure the channel by safeguarding it from possible demonetization, and also invest in better equipment, software, and more people to help us improve our videos going forward. In short, without your contributions, these videos would not be possible. So if you would like to ensure this channel never has to shut down due to demonetization, please spare whatever you can per month and become People Profiles patrons. Thanks for listening.